So what happens at this point is the refugee crisis across the world is massive. Again, this is post-World War II. Empires collapse, new states are established, borders are delineated, tens of millions of people flee across borders, and they're refugees. A lot of them are handled locally, without any assistance. Israel absorbs the Jewish refugees from the West Bank, from Gaza, from Jerusalem, from the Jewish quarter. It absorbs the Jewish refugees who are ethnically cleansed from across the Arab world, partly in revenge for the establishment of the State of Israel. They absorb all the Jewish refugees from Europe, from the displaced persons camps, and they do it without any international help. That's Israel and the Jewish refugees. Then you have other countries, Hindus and Muslims in India are ultimately absorbed, but in some places, a local agency is established in order to help the refugees be settled. So in order to understand UNRWA, which is for the Arab refugees, we should talk about UNRWA.
So it's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency
for Palestine refugees,
okay,
which also included the Jews, but again, Israel took care of them. So at about the same time, another agency is established called UNRWA. The K is for Korea, for the Korean War and the refugees from the Korean War. And why is it a temporary agency like UNRWA? Because the idea is that you settle the refugees in a few short years and you move on, you close down, and it's over. Refugee crises were meant to be settled quickly and be over.
And to be clear, legally, the idea is if a refugee is made a refugee but finds a home somewhere else,
yes,
then they're no longer a refugee.
Of course.
As a legal matter, they're
yeah, and there's no demand or priority that the only way for a refugee to stop being a refugee is to go back to where they were.
Yeah,
that's not the international standard. So 3.1 million.
Even today, by the way, in recent times, so the Syrian civil war, you have something like hundreds of thousands of refugees, close to 500,000 refugees that fled Syria, Bashar Assad's brutality, and they wound up all over the place. And there's no sense that they're just in a temporary place waiting to return to a sovereign Syria. They are if they are given a home or naturalized somewhere else, that's it.
Yes. The general view and convention on refugees that applies to everyone in the world says basically there's three ways that refugees are settled. In the places to which they fled, if they can go home, great, or in a third place, and all of these are equivalent. They're equally good ways of ending a refugee situation. The entire refugee convention doesn't care who started what, who's to blame. It just cares about a person being able to start their new life. End of story.
Somewhere.
Yeah. Exactly. So the Koreans are settled 3.1 within a few short years with
3.1 million
Korean refugees, a few short years, a third of the budget of UNRWA, and look at South Korea today.
And then the commission's disbanded.
And that's it.
Right.
UNRWA is closed. It was temporary.
Right.
Huge success. Look at South Korea today. Could have been the Arabs.
Yeah.
But no, the Arabs have UNRWA, and they refuse to settle. They refuse to go the path of the Koreans. And essentially, they engage in a tug of war with the Americans and the British that are funding UNRWA at this point because they don't want to be settled. And what they do is the British and the Americans want to close down UNRWA by the 50s, the end of the 50s. They're like, they look at UNRWA. UNRWA already settled 3.1 million. They're like, this UNRWA is achieving nothing. It's useless. It hasn't settled one Arab refugee. So we're going to close it down. So there was no question that UNRWA was a failed project. This is the moment of the Eisenhower Doctrine, oil, the Cold War. So the Arabs come to the Americans in a kind of mob-style scene, which we describe in the book, and they say, you don't want to make another mistake. You made one mistake. You allowed a Jewish state to emerge. You're not going to close down UNRWA. So from the beginning, in the Arab mindset, UNRWA was the antidote to the existence of the Jewish state. Mm-hmm. Keeping the Arab refugees from settling was the way to essentially send the message that the war in which the Jewish state declared independence was a bump in the road. It will be undone in time, Give us a this is just something that's temporary and will be over soon enough. And what the Arabs do with UNRWA is that they do three things that plague us to this day. The first is they make sure that the agency is called UNRWA, UN. It was going to be called RIWA or UNRWA. It's not really a UN body. It's a temporary instrument established by the General Assembly to solve a specific problem. It's not a UN organ. But they wanted it to be called UN because in the Arab perspective and imagination, the UN created Israel and the UN is responsible for the refugees. It's certainly not the Jews who created Israel. And they have no responsibility for waging war against the Jewish state, a completely unnecessary war. They could have had their own state, no refugees, no one displaced, living side by side with the Jewish state of Israel. But no, their top priority was no Jewish state, so they waged war. And they failed to achieve their goal, and refugees were created. But in their imagination, they bear zero responsibility for that. It's all on the UN. So they made sure it was called UNRWA. Then they made sure that when the UN created the actual refugee agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugee, they created a loophole for UNRWA because they understood very clearly that if the Arab refugees from the war will be treated like all of the refugees in the world, and they looked at what the international standards were, they understood that within a few years there's going to be no Arab refugees and the Jewish state gets to stay. And no, that's unacceptable. So they make sure that the UNHCR basically treats all refugees in the world except those who have an agency. And then they make sure that UNRWA never closes, so that the loophole is always maintained.
And the refugee status applies to the descendants, multiple generation.
Okay, so now that they've created this loophole and this little fiefdom, the Arabs essentially take over UNRWA. Beginning in the 60s, UNRWA essentially becomes a Palestinian organization. It becomes the welfare, healthcare, education system of the now increasingly known as Palestinians, waiting to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. And in the service of this perpetuation of the refugee status until the moment that the Jewish state is no more, until that moment, they begin to essentially inflate the number of refugees in a variety of ways. The first is by creating a really bizarre definition of a refugee that is not the international definition, just about being 2 years in here and losing livelihood. And that's not, generally refugees, it's about personal persecution. Okay, so first they inflate the numbers by having a different definition. They inflate the numbers by creating this hereditary status.
Which doesn't apply to any other refugee group.
In other refugee situations, the descendants of refugees can individually apply for a dependent status. It's not a refugee status, it's a dependent. They have to be under 18, and the status personally has to justify it. Mm-hmm. This kind of automatic generation after generation, no looking at personal situation, that's only for the Arab refugees. So, bizarre definition, perpetual, multi-generational refugeehood. And another way of inflating the numbers is that they never, ever take anyone off the rosters. So a huge number of the refugees are Jordanian citizens. As we said, everywhere in the world, citizens of other countries are no longer refugees. But UNRWA doesn't have to abide by what's called the cessation clause, what ends a refugee status. So all the citizens of Jordan are also, those who are from this background are also registered as refugees from Palestine. My favorite refugee is the multimillionaire, playboy, American citizen, father of supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid. He's an American citizen. He's not your vision of what a refugee is. But because he was registered by UNRWA, he was born in Syria, he remains on their roster forever. UNRWA never goes and checks whether refugees have better lives now. Are they settled somewhere else? Nope. It keeps them on the books.
Do they have citizenship of he's a citizen of the United States?
It doesn't care because for UNRWA, because it's been taken over by the Palestinians, there's only one thing that ends their refugeehood, no Jewish state. Anything else does not end their refugee status.